A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, Greg Bondar is the national spokesman for the Christian Voice Australia. He's also leader of Every Home for Christ in Australia, and he's been jet-setting around the world and checking out some things that have been going on in the UK. He's back with us. Welcome back to you, Greg Bondar.
Oh, thank you very much. Good to be back on air.
You know, as I'm contemplating the things we're going to talk about today, Greg, the things that are happening overseas just serves to highlight just how far we've fallen here in Australia. In the UK, they only recently voted in favour of abortion up to birth and assisted suicide. And for a lot of listeners, they'll know that sort of stuff is already in place here in Australia. But you're back from jet setting. Did you have a good experience in the UK?
Oh, Neil, I had a wonderful time. But look, I have to tell you, if anybody thinks travelling's fun, they've got rocks in their head, Neil. 24 hours to get to London. I'm not a 20-year-old anymore, Neil.
No, it's those long-haul flights. They can be really, really tiring.
Yeah.
Hey, you got to be a part of a launch from in the UK of a report, the case against abortion buffer zones. Give us a little insight here into what the thinking is from Christian leaders in the UK, given the disturbing developments they've had there.
Yeah, thank you. Now, look, this is most interesting because I met with the Chief Executive, Andrea Williams, of Christian Concern. She also heads up Christian Legal Centre there as well. And we had a long chat over lunch, may I add, which was a wonderful lunch in point of fact. But what came out of that was that she said to me that I must attend the launch of the new abortion buffer zones report, which was commissioned by Christian Concern. Dr. Martin Parsons and Dr. Gregory Gardner did the report, and they were both independent. So what came out of this was, and quite frankly, I know we've already got it in Australia, but they raised the point that the report was highlighting whether these buffer zones were really trying to protect the vulnerable, as they say, or actually reintroducing state censorship. So, Neil, it raised some really disturbing points, the report, which is over 100 pages long.
100 pages report, and from what I understand, Greg, the fact that there is a report like this, the fact that the legislation has been introduced in the UK and it's all passed through now, that in itself is evidence for women changing their minds as a result of the presence of pro-life supporters. That in itself ought to just, switch on something in every Christian believer, ought it not?
Absolutely, Neil. And this is what came out. When I heard the speakers it was actually held at the Medical Christian Organisation's office, which is very interesting because these are all doctors that have formed a society to ensure that Christian beliefs are maintained in hospital. So anyway, what happened was that when I heard the report that, the activity that was undertaken by a lot of pro-life supporters resulted in women actually changing their minds before walking into the abortion clinics, and that in itself tells you a lot, Nell, because quite frankly, trying to criminalise peaceful activities, silent prayer, or even holding up a sign is really, and I think as the organisation Christian Concern said, reintroducing state censorship, Neil. And quite frankly, we've got to revisit what we're doing here in Australia, I think.
And of course, everyone will agree that when there is a Christian voice that approaches a woman who may be contemplating abortion, they're not doing that out of any other motive other than compassion, both for the baby and for the woman. So when you've got legislation then that silences and distances that compassionate voice, you've got compassionate voices being silenced by the state, haven't you?
Absolutely. And what's happening is that they are, this sort of legislation is really suppressing dissent. It's marginalising Christian beliefs, and quite frankly, it's eroding the very freedoms that underpin our democracy. So buffer zones, to me, are incompatible with a free and just society. Now, we have to try and approach policymakers, churches, and everybody in the community to, quite frankly, stand up for truth, compassion and liberty now.
And here in Australia, Greg, these laws have been in place for a while. It's almost like the dust has settled, and even Christians have said, okay, well, that's the laws. We've seen cases go right through to the High Court here in Australia, and this sort of state authoritarianism has been reinforced even at High Court level. No, you can't go and you can't be compassionate towards women and those unborn babies. So in Australia, the comparison is very real. We've had it here for a while, but this reasoning, it really makes sense.
Well, interestingly, the report highlighted, Neil, which I don't know whether it was highlighted here in Australia, I'll have to check my records, but it reported that the actual legislation in the UK breached around about 25 human rights provisions, and that in itself is incompatible with legislation that says, we have a freedom of speech. So, Neil, when it breaches 25 human rights conditions under the United Nations Charter, that's an area for concern, Neil, and I think that's got to be revisited.
So buffer zones or bubble zones here in Australia, incompatible with the free and just society. That's what this report has delivered and determined. There's a call for policymakers and for churches and for ordinary citizens to stand up for truth, compassion and liberty.
Correct.
And when you're a Christian, you say, well, okay, I just let this one go through to the keeper, or is there some responsibility I have? We might be thinking that anyone that wants to silence our quiet witness of love, life and truth must be resisted in some way. Hey, we've been talking about a quiet revival that's going on in Western nations, here in Australia. This is a fabulous and exciting thing. But you've been contemplating the thought that if you're having quiet revival, really that needs to accompany what would be some sort of moral revival, moral reformation as well.
Absolutely, Neil. One of the things that came to light while I was in UK meeting at the Every Home for Christ board meeting, what happened was there that the moral compass of UK MPs has quite frankly reached the bottom as far as I'm concerned. What's happened, Neil, there was that there was a period where the UK MPs voted in favour of abortion up to birth and assisted suicide. And yet you had some of these MPs attending a parliamentary prayer breakfast and actually praying when they voted in favour of abortion and assisted suicide. Now, look, the moral compass has completely gone, as far as I'm concerned, with the UK MPs, and I think that's filtering through to a lot of other nations, in particular Australia now.
Certainly a display of hypocrisy, especially if those MPs claim to be Christian. But as I understand it, in the UK, as it was in Australia, there were MPs dancing in the Parliament because they had passed this sort of, certainly on the euthanasia legislation. Yeah. The moral compass of MPs, whether it's UK or whether it's in Australia, somehow or other, without a biblical focus, without a biblical foundation, there is no real moral compass anyway, is there?
No, none at all, Neil, at this point in time. And it's worth reflecting, and not from an accusation point of view, but from honesty, would the situation in both the UK and Australia have changed if the church was far more watchful in the lead up to these pieces of legislation, or did we speak with clarity and consistency in terms of the value of life on the sanctity of God's image? We've got to ask ourselves, did we offer truth? Now we've got to revisit this in honesty, not in accusation. And I really believe that we let ourselves down in many ways. I know there were a lot of activities, objecting to this, but the point I'm trying to make here is that, I think we stood still for far too long as a church. And as such, Neil, I think, we need to really revisit and do some navel gazing here in terms of what other legislation will come forward if we don't take the right action. We're going to be in all sorts of trouble, Neil, from a moral compass point of view.
Well, I like your context there. It's very easy to blame MPs And yes, we do need to be able to designate blame if we're also looking carefully at other bodies like the church. And some of us are going to say, well, we're part of the church, and you just mentioned the church hasn't been really prepared. It wasn't in Australia, wasn't in the UK, didn't stand up where it needed to. And then you come back to the individual. And we say to each one of us individually, well, we need this sort of assessment of our own moral compass, because if you haven't got a personal moral compass, how can you expect the church to have a moral compass, and how can you expect the MPs to have a moral compass? So there's a lot of people you can point blame at, but ultimately it comes back to where are we standing and what are we doing personally?
Correct, Neil. And I think we've got to look at ourselves. Can we as individuals prioritise these matters from a gospel-centred viewpoint? And quite frankly, Neil, and I keep saying to everybody and you my view, church and state are one. We have to ensure that the church Christians are involved in the public square. Otherwise, this type of legislation will continue to overlap our Christian beliefs now.
And I guess not all churches are disengaged. Lots of churches are really engaged, and we need to look for opportunities. Sometimes we think the opportunities are exhausted, but you've got to look for creative new ways, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely, Neil. I think, one of the things I think we need to do is the church needs to reinvigorate itself from the point of view, does it want to ensure that a biblical worldview is being upheld in Parliament? Now, as I said, Neil, I'm writing this book again on the church and state, the role of the church in terms of legislation, in terms of the public square. And unless we revisit that, Neil, it's going to end up in a situation where we will be marginalised Christians. We will be looking at how can we reflect our faith in the public square. But the problem is silence is not an answer now.
This voice that we think we have, that we hope we have, that we might aspire to have, we've seen free speech diminishing so much here in Australia. Yeah. You had some connection with one of the champions of free speech who went through the courts in the UK. His name's Christian Hacking. What was that connection there?
Yeah, well, he was at the launch of the buffer zones report, Neil, and he gave his testimony. Some of you may remember, some of your listeners may remember, Neil, but back in August 2019, he was praying outside an abortion clinic, and apparently he was violating a thing called the Public Spaces Protection Order. And as a result, he was prosecuted, but the good news was that the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. Now, Neil, the problem we've got here is a man giving his testimony as to why he believed that he had the freedom or the right to be able to protest outside an abortion clinic. But isn't it interesting, Neil, that the charges were dropped because there wasn't enough evidence to provide a realistic prospect of conviction? For goodness sake, Neil, what have we come to?
Well, as we say often on this program, talking to various ones who've been dragged before the courts, the process is the punishment. Yep. No, there's never enough evidence to convict, but the process is what the ones who want to have something against Christians doing their compassionate thing, that's the thing that they're focusing on. Hey, the thought that Christian Hacking had around the fact of millions of lives are at stake and silence is not an option. You need people like Christian Hacking.
Correct.
And we've seen these examples here in Australia too, various ones who've stood up and gone through the courts. When silence is not an option, they're prepared to make sacrifices.
Absolutely, Neil. He was saying, and I was so impressed by this, he opened his speech by saying that the real decision we need to make about freedom of speech is between chicken tikka or chicken korma. And everybody started to laugh. And then he said, I use that example because I want to clarify that was the meal choice he was given while being held after his arrest. So he's really saying, there are a lot of lives at stake. Is it going to come down to the choice of chicken tikka or chicken korma, or are we willing to sacrifice our rights to protect free speech now?
Well, free speech, an essential aspect of a just society, and something I guess we all have to come to grips with, and the role that we might play in that, the role that we might even aspire to before putting our feet on the street. You know, I'm thinking of people like Graham Preston and Kathy Clubb. They were the two Aussies that went right through to the High Court around this whole thing with the bubble zones. I mean, they are champions of Christian faith, motivated to do what they did because of their Christian faith and standing up for the unborn. Hey, wonderful insights. You're back from the UK. Have you got any other special initiatives that are on the boil at the moment, so far as Every Home for Christ?
Yes, Neil. Look, I'm going to be very open here because we're going to start a campaign, Neil, called Rechurching Australia. And I've mentioned this to you before. Yep. What we're going to do here, Neil, is we are going to distribute 500,000 postcards around Australia, getting people back into church, and secondly, getting them to make sure that they connect with a local pastor, a local church, a local Christian group or a home group. Because, Neil, we have to rechurch Australia. Based on the information I have, as you know, Christianity is on the decline, although whilst I was in the UK, there were signs of the young groups taking more of an interest in Christianity. So, Neil, our campaign, Rechurching Australia, 500,000 postcards to be distributed Australia-wide later in the year, around about September, Neil.
Okay, that one's bubbling along, and we have spoken about it before. It's something to look forward to. It's a good campaign run by Every Home for Christ, and you can connect with Greg Bondar. He's the national spokesperson both for Christian Voice Australia, and he's the national leader of Every Home for Christ in Australia, everyhomeforchrist.org.au, and christianvoiceaustralia.com.au to connect with Greg Bondar. Greg, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil, and God bless all your listeners.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.